Hello, this is Dr. Kate Antonova, Professor of History at the City University of New York, and this is History in Practice. My kind of topic for this video is what it feels like to live through history. I thought it'd be interesting to talk about this from a historian's perspective. We are all experiencing history. You've heard, I'm sure, people quoting the so-called Chinese proverb. I have no idea if it's actually a Chinese proverb, but what people say, may you live through interesting times, it's actually a curse, of course. And we're all realizing that our times have been a little too interesting, right? For a really long time now. So one of the kind of observations I wanted to bring to you is an experience I had back in 2017 before things were quite to the level of difficultness they are now. Back in 2017 was the centennial year of the Russian Revolution, 1917. So, like most teachers of Russian history, I had a bunch of courses specifically on the Russian Revolution, different levels, different types of courses for different students. One of the things we did in all my courses was to check in each day on, I think there were actually two different ones, organizations that posted to Twitter every day of 2017 quotes from primary sources that were written in 1917 on the appropriate day, right? So you could follow these on Twitter and you would be experiencing the voices of various people around mostly Europe, but mainly Russia in 1917 to experience how events felt as they were going down, right? It was a really amazing experience and a really cool thing that Twitter can do for us now. And by the way, they do it for other events, other centennials and so on, for different events. So it's something you might want to look for on Twitter. It's a lot of fun and really interesting to follow along. So we would do that in my classes. We check in on it, and I asked one particular class students to sort of decide sort of what side they're on, just pick it arbitrarily, of the political conflict very early on, and sort of especially follow those kinds of people, quotes from those people, and see how things change over time, how their experiences change over time, what they're noticing, so on. So we looked really attentively at this, and one of the things we found, obviously we had lots of interesting observations, and I'm not going to dig deep into the history of the revolution here, that's not my point. But one of the kind of biggest observations we took from it is how, even though 1917, as we learn it in history classes, as we teach it, was this huge year when a lot went down, right? So much happens with world-changing implications. It totally changes the largest country on earth, happens in the middle of World War I, so much, so quickly, all in one year. When you're experiencing it, actually, it's incredibly slow. It's incredibly slow. How much of that year was about all of these very anxious observers waiting? Doesn't that feel really familiar? Doesn't that feel like how we're living our lives right now? There's so much uncertainty. You have just no idea what's coming next. And it's weeks between, sometimes months between big bits of news. And then when big things happen, like in 1917, there was an aborted right-wing coup attempt. There was a renewal of riots. There's the first set of riots in February topples the monarchy. And then there's it kind of breaks out again in July. It still doesn't resolve into anything. There's still this provisional temporary government. There's still kind of no conclusion. So even when things happen, you're still mired in uncertainty. And I think that's a lot of the stress we're all living through today is when we're not living in such interesting times, the future seems predictable for most people. Of course, many people on the planet have been living in interesting times far longer than we have. Continuously sometimes, who have experienced more periods of that kind of thing. But I'm an American sitting in America with a presumed mostly American audience, and that's kind of where I'm speaking. For Americans, this is new to us, relatively new, certainly people of my age. I grew up, literally my sort of coming of age was right in the middle of Francis Fukuyama's so-called end of history phase. So my generation, particularly Gen X, kind of came of age in a period of thinking big stuff kind of doesn't happen anymore, which, looking back was such nonsense. And I think there was some kind of feeling at the time that's not possible. But there was a lot of hope too, that actually civilization had kind of figured some things out. Oh, how naive we were, right? We've obviously learned nothing. That's become abundantly clear. That's about the only thing that is clear. So anyway, it's really, really stressful for people. And of course, this is true as much for people in the past as for us. We're all people. It's really, really stressful to live with huge uncertainty, not just personal uncertainty. And for some of us, we may have, fairly stable things going on personally, although most of us frankly don't, because the outside world does affect us. But even bigger, just your understanding of the world and your place in it and how the world works, that being destabilized and sitting in uncertainty for months or years at a time is insanely stressful. It is extremely difficult for brains to process. And frankly, it is, relatively recent in the sense of the last 200 to 300 years, depending on your socioeconomic level, where it was possible to know this much about the world. And that is, frankly, I think not really good for our health. I mean, obviously, I love knowing about the world. It's what I do for a living. I obsessively follow events. One of the things I've really had to adapt to as our times have gotten more interesting is compartmentalizing a lot of this. I do follow. I don't know how I would live without sort of knowing what's going on in the world, which is maybe not a good thing for me. But I've been working really, really hard to compartmentalize and limit the times during which I can expose myself to what's going on in the world, and carving out other times. It's a struggle, but because it's almost impossible to function, you can just become completely paralyzed. You can lose all perspective. And that then is an experience we can take from our times and take it back and look at something like 1917, when historians and students of history are looking at the decision makers of a major change like the Russian revolutions and trying to figure out, understand what were the perspectives of the decision makers. One of the things we can look back on that and see, reading these kind of Twitter moment in time accounts, even though I read a lot of those same primary sources as whole separate primary sources in college and grad school, for fun, some of them, a lot of them are fairly famous. When you read them as your own thing, you're thinking about it as a 21st century citizen reading about this deeply past thing. These people are different from us. It's a different time and place. When you get it moment by moment in Twitter, and we're also living in our own very different but separate, interesting times, you process it in a different way, and you kind of feel the uncertainty directly in a way you couldn't before. And that makes your judgment of the decision making different as well. I think part of it is we're allowed to just recognize the paralyzing anxiety of uncertainty, that plays, frankly, a huge role in history. And that's part of how people make decisions. Now, obviously, that's not all of it. It's not like everyone's randomly making, crazy irrational decisions because they're so terrified all the time. Excuse me. Hopefully not, right? But it's a factor that I think hasn't always been recognized, and certainly something I learned from kind of living through interesting times. And from watching old interesting times in 1917. But the other kind of thing I wanted to bring up with this, that was kind of just one kind of big observation. But the other observation I have watching actually our time, all of us living on Twitter right now and watching us experience interesting times. And part of my observations come from kind of comparing it to following 1917 people, right, on Twitter as well, is one of the things that paralyzing uncertainty does to a lot of us, and I feel it. I'm just showing you how the path through which I became conscious of it, and how my perspective on it is a little bit different from my experience as a historian. So it's something I'm observing, and I feel the same feelings, but I think about it differently because of my training as a historian. One of the things that living through interesting times does to us, and I think this has become much more true, maybe true for the first time, I don't know, but definitely much more true for us today. One of the things that's different about us now in 2022 versus 100 years ago, but much, much more different than 300 years ago, is that we have experienced history as popular history, as part of our culture. Now, I could have all kinds of criticisms about how much we actually know, but we all have a kind of general cultural awareness of history as a thing. It comes through, cartoons, documentaries, historical fiction and films, all kinds of things, as well as hopefully some formal education, hopefully reading some more serious books based on research, and some of the best popular history books that are also based on research. But we do, as a population, the world has more awareness of our own history now than we had 300 years ago. Now, very educated people had some awareness, but it's mostly a formal kind of formal study, not with the same principles and so on as the way we do it now, but whatever, still formal study, right? It wasn't the sort of popular cultural awareness of history, which I'm going to just say is a thing, regardless of how accurate or inaccurate it is, largely inaccurate. Talk about that another time. But we have this. And so we have this kind of popular imagination of what history is, how history moves. Much of Western European and North American attitudes, and I'm going to restrict it there because I don't know enough about the rest of the world and how they view history in a popular sense. But Western, which is not my favorite term anyway, but meaning Western European and North American culture tends to, at the popular level, not in scholarship anymore, view history as basically a progressive line leading towards ourselves. Yeah, we're super arrogant about that. But anyway, another subject for another video. But part of what is involved when that's our popular sense of history is that when you think about old-timey stuff, right? Things in the past, you think about it as the further back you go, being more restrictive, lower quality of life, much more likely to die of disease, right? And to some extent, some parts of that are true. I'll talk another time about how that's also problematic in a lot of ways. But when we think about history that way, it can be especially, I'll say, traumatic to experience big, scary changes right now, because there is a certain unconscious expectation that things are always getting better. When things seem to feel like they're getting backwards, it's not just the fear of things going backwards. And for many of us who would be directly affected by that, I mean, mainly, anyone marginalized, women, but I'm, white, middle to upper middle class American woman. So for me, it's relatively little, to whatever degree of privilege, you have in the power structure of our society, it's going to affect you really, really directly. That itself is terrifying. I don't want to minimize that, but you can add an extra level of terror of knowing it feels like it's going backwards and it's not supposed to, as if something's fundamentally wrong with the universe. And there's, a lot of jokes we make about, let's try to hit reset on the universe, right? Or we're in the wrong timeline. Those kinds of jokes are expressing this feeling that it's not supposed to go this way. What a historian will tell you is that kind of progressive view of history, it's otherwise known as a Whig view of history, is in WHIG from the British liberalish party of the 19th century, which is kind of where historically that kind of writing of history originated. But that sense has not actually ever been accurate. As history kind of moves, there's no conscious line. It's not that like it's, well, I mean, you could say in a sense, I suppose I sort of believe it's totally random. I mean, I believe it's super contingent, and that things are always where some people are gaining rights or gaining access to healthcare, others are losing. And that has been true at many different periods of time. There is no easy line to draw. The only way you can get there to an easy line of progress is if you exclusively look at propertied white European men. And because they have dominated the story of history, it looked like a story of progress for a while. But anyway, again, trying to leave that to another video. What I'm trying to get at is how unsettling it is if you're, and it's largely unconscious because it comes from our culture. We're steeped in this. So even as a historian trained to think very differently, I still feel that because I'm steeped in the same culture we all are, of it's not supposed to go this way. It's supposed to get better, not worse. That is very upsetting. And also, the other kind of part of it is when we have experienced history passively as something you watch on TV or that you read books about, but particularly for people of my age, I think this is far less true for my children, for example, who unfortunately their entire lives have been interesting times. For those of us who grew up in less interesting times and have reached into this, and I have to ask my parents about, their youth was in very interesting times as boomers, and then things kind of got quiet, historically speaking, with the fall of communism and everything. From an American perspective, it felt like things got quiet. Obviously, it totally did not. There were genocides happening in the world at the time. So that is an incredibly Amerocentric and Eurocentric view of the world. Anyway, again, try not to get distracted. So from that kind of perspective of having felt like, from our very subjective experience, that things were less interesting and then they got more interesting, what can happen is that when you view history as something that you just watch, and of course, most of us have no real power to change events right now, right? These are things happening in, the smoke-filled room somewhere that most of us don't have access to, the room where it happens, right? To quote Hamilton. So the problem of experiencing this is that you become passive watching our own times. We think, when is when's a hero going to come in and save us? And you can see this. It's overwhelming on social media to watch, one so-called hero after another. It was Robert Mueller. It was Comey, even briefly for a while, although he turned out to be quite an anti-hero in many ways. Various candidates in the election. Some people, it's Biden. Trump plays the same role for people on another political perspective. Everybody's sort of waiting for someone else to appear and fix things, because you're sort of picturing, and I do think this is mostly unconscious, but really think about it. Think about if this is where you're really coming from, that you experience history as something you watch, maybe walk through in a museum or read, and you're waiting for the next chapter when something will come in and fix it, and that ultimately it is moving towards something better rather than something worse. That is a narrative form that we have come to expect from history, from these various cultural sources. And when that keeps not happening, either because it's not happening fast enough or because it's not going to happen, that realization is intensely terrifying. It's intensely destabilizing. It's why a lot of us are eating our feelings, are discombobulated a lot of the time, and just forgetting things we don't normally forget. That's our body's way of responding to this terrible lack of certainty and fear that it's not just an uncertain future, that it's potentially not the future we expected. Now, I know from studying people who have lived in places where the norm is this kind of chaos and uncertainty, and often things just keep getting worse. I'm a Russianist, that there's a kind of, a lot of times, and this, nothing is universal, but a lot of times the cultural interpretation of this becomes a kind of acceptance, a kind of turning in towards the personal and shutting out the larger things, a kind of giving up hope for larger things, and turning towards trying to sort of live in your own little bubble. That is one of the ways of coping. Whether that's the best way of coping or not, I don't know. Don't ask me. Ask a therapist. That's not my area. But those are other ways where other cultures, for example, have lived with this for much longer than most middle-class Americans have. I'm assuming that more marginalized Americans than me are also dealing with this their entire lives. And I know there are people who've spoken and written about that. And so you turn to those people for that kind of experience. I'm kind of trying to talk to other, frankly, privileged white Americans who are experiencing like I am, and sort of welcome to the club. And I can only say welcome to the club because I was not in this club either, except that as a historian, I could observe it from outside. And so I feel like I'm sort of in a position within my culture of privileged white Americans who've had, particularly my generation, who had a pretty amazingly peaceful. Meanwhile, we were literally fighting a war far away during my childhood, and it had zero impact on my life. I mean, I was consciously aware of it. I was disturbed by it, but the people who died, the people whose lives were destroyed, remote. That's privilege, right? That's privilege. I wasn't rich. I wasn't famous. I didn't have any of the what you might think of privilege means. I had the privilege of being completely oblivious to the destruction my government was actually perpetrating in faraway places of the world. So it felt like a peaceful time to me, even though it absolutely wasn't. There are no peaceful times. Anyway, trying to get back on track. So from that perspective, from this particular perspective, I feel like my being a historian and having sort of an intellectual awareness, but also feeling the same feelings as other people in the particular kind of group I'm talking about, I recognize what those feelings are. And what I see on social media is a lot of people sort of just passively waiting around for something to happen and kind of getting scared that nothing is going to happen or only bad things will happen. And as a historian, one thing I know is that change always happens. The kind of feeling that particularly my generation, I think, has that change is something that happened in the past. It doesn't happen anymore. No, false. Change is always happening. And yeah, we can't guarantee that it's going to be a change for the better. Absolutely not. Change is always happening. And frankly, every historical change is for the better for some and for the worse for others. That's how it works, actually, in reality. And how does change happen? There are, I think, two major ways. Obviously, there's infinite ways, actually, but I'm going to talk about two major ways that I think are relevant that I think most of us are kind of missing. And again, us meaning sort of people like me. One way change happens is individuals not sitting back and passively watching events like it's a television show, but doing something. And I know what you're going to say because I feel it too. What can I do? I'm a nobody. What can I do? Yes, call your representatives. We live in a democracy theoretically. Yes, give money where you can. Give blood when there's crises, or actually regularly is a good idea. Contribute less to the worsening of our climate. Recycle, those kinds of things, right? I hope we're all trying to do our part with that, and if we aren't, we need to, right? There's a degree to which individual choices cannot solve these problems. It needs to be systematic. And if we live in a democracy, theoretically, and that is very much a question mark these days, and I think always has been, to the degree of voter suppression has always been far greater than people like me have wanted to acknowledge. But to whatever degree we can pressure our governments, we need to. And that doesn't mean just voting. It means directly pressuring the people we voted for to act. And so what do we want those leaders to do to act? Leadership is a thing that I think a lot of Americans have forgotten about. Particularly, I would say the left half of American politics, by which I mean everything left of fascism, which has become our left half, frighteningly. And I'm using pure academic terms of politics derived from the French Revolution of what right, left, center, fascism, leftism mean. Those are the terms I use. I'm an academic, I'm trained in those terms. I'm using them rather differently than they're used in our popular culture. I'll have to do a whole other video on that. But that is the way in which I'm using the terms. It is actually academically derived general understanding that is mappable, right? And is accurate and is unrelated to people's self-identities of where they think they are. Anyway, so this whole, everything to the left of fascism in American politics has, over the last several decades, more and more talked about and acted as if politics is basically policy. There's a big difference between policy and politics. Policy are, the kinds of laws we want, right? The kind of rules we want to live by, and they're incredibly important. That's actually what enacts the changes, right? And actually regulates behavior within a government. I'm not saying that's not important at all, but it is separate from politics, which is theater, which is about rhetoric. It is about changing people's minds. And I think a lot of us, because we've seen huge polarization and huge kind of digging in the heels ideologically, where most people have picked a team and are identifying their whole person with that team, are totally unwilling to hear what the other team has to say. That's what we mean by polarization. That is really unhealthy for politics. It is really hard to get any kind of actual policy changes through in that climate. But the point of politics, as opposed to policy, the way you get to policy is through politics. And politics is the theater of leading, of changing people's minds, of changing the rules of the game, of changing the rhetoric, of changing how people think, how people identify. It is an art. It is difficult. It requires skill. It requires guts. It has to be active, not reactive. Our leadership culture, and it's actually true to an extent on both sides. I think Trump is a huge exception to this, and I believe it's a big part of how he ended up, against all odds, let's face it, as an actual president, which I still have trouble believing happened, from having grown up with 30 years of him being a literal punchline, right? It's still odd, and it is a crazy thing that happened. Why did it happen? I think he was the one exception in the last 40 or 50 years of anyone in politics who is not treating politics as a reactive practice of reacting to polls, reacting to public opinion as it exists, reacting to how much support there is in Congress and among lobbyists and campaign donors and people for certain policies. That is entirely reactive, right? You're saying, what does it look like I can get done? I'll try to do that. That's, frankly, it's committee work. It's what committees do. What leaders do is they create consensus. They create a new frame of a debate. They create options that might actually get support by reframing it. And that can partly be the kind of quid pro quo, Lyndon Johnson style of wheeling and dealing. I'll give you this, you give me this. That's part of it. But the other really part of it that's almost just forgotten, except by historians, but is very real. It may have, I don't know, did it die with FDR? I'm not an Americanist. Maybe with JFK. I'm leaning actually more towards FDR, but whatever, that's a debate for Americanists. The kind of leadership we seem to have just forgotten is a thing. And I guarantee you as a historian is absolutely a thing. It's a crucial thing, is the kind of leadership that changes minds. And I know you're going to say, oh, nobody's mind can be changed anymore. Yes, they can. How do you think we got where we are? Because we are where we are and we're paralyzingly terrified of where we are, does not mean it can't change. Change is guaranteed. As a historian, I'm telling you, change always happens. Change is guaranteed. What direction it goes, no guarantees. And that's the really scary part. But I do believe Trump got into power because he led. Now, I think he led in ways that were morally completely evil. I'm just going to say it that way. He led through racism and violence, but he changed people's minds. He took feelings and coalesced them into a consensus behind policies that were frankly insane, like the wall, right? That it's batshit, it's nuts, it has no bearing on reality. Yet a whole bunch of people still really, really believe in it. Even now, after, you know, we saw how it went, doesn't change their views. That tells you right there that it's not about policy. As important as policy is not what changes people's minds. Even the effects of policy once instituted does not change people's minds. What changes people's minds? Leadership, actually, the art of not just convincing, but of taking feelings and moving in them in a direction. That can be done for evil. Hitler, obviously, right, the easy example there, but you know, Mussolini and a lot of other charismatic leaders around the world. You can be reactive to, you know, really bad cultural conflicts that are out there. And I think Trump has partly just been reactive to conflicts and polarization, frankly, just racism that is deeply embedded in this country. One of the things he did was just acknowledge that it's there and then utilize it for his own personal ends. That's leadership in action. I'm sorry to say, it's horrifying, it's evil, but it's leadership in action. The thing is, it doesn't have to be used for evil, it can be used for good. So the art of leadership, of changing the dialogue, of using new terms, of reframing, and the key thing here is capturing the feelings, capturing the existing narratives. Oh, Reagan, I try to kind of block out Reagan sometimes, but Reagan did this, great communicator, right? I disagree with everything policy-wise that Reagan ever did. Personally, I don't care, you know, you can think something different, I don't mind, it's fine. But what I'm trying to say about Reagan is that even for everybody who strongly disagreed with him, right, it is undeniable that he had a gift for taking the feelings, the narratives that yank at people's heartstrings and turning it towards his own ends. I didn't like the ends he turned it towards. FDR is an example of someone where I do think the ends he turned it towards are amazing, and did huge amount of good. It created the mid-century that, you know, all the Make America Great Again, people are so nostalgic for the mid-century. Who created that? FDR, the, you know, greatest liberal president, the most left-wing president we've ever had, in my opinion, who is, you know, a little bit socialistic-ish. Not that we can say that here, but again, speaking in strict actual definitions of these terms, not the bullshit they use on TV, actual definitions of those terms, he's the furthest in that direction of any president we've had, and he produced the reality so many people are so nostalgic for. Not that he was perfect, and there's issues there as well, but there's so much misunderstanding. There's misunderstanding of the facts of history, there's misunderstanding of history itself, but there's also kind of doubt that change can happen. Change does happen, but it happens through people doing things. Okay, so all of that was about individual choices and our expectations for leadership that I think are just fundamentally wrong. And it's our fear of sort of everyone, again, left of fascism, our absolute terror of what's going on right now, that is blocking us off from seeing the way out, actually. And the way out is primarily leadership, and expecting that and choosing it, picking the safest, most likely to win kind of candidate, which is what we traditionally have done. Notice it hasn't been going very well. I'm just going to say that. Leave it there for now. I don't want to get into the weeds there. But the other kind of change, okay, that's individual choices and actions. The other kind of change is collective action. And that's the other really big problem. The other big motor of change, if I have to kind of generalize it out into just a few ways history can change, is collective action. Collective action, I mean, we often talk in academia about the collective action problem because it's really, really hard, because collective action is made up of a whole bunch of people making individual choices, but making them all at the same time in the same direction. It's really hard. Sometimes it just happens spontaneously. There's something about what's going on that just kind of drives it moves so many people in the same direction at the same time that it just kind of happens, right? Other times people work for decades to make it happen through community organizing, organizing in whatever sense, whether it's community-based or otherwise, political organizing, political activism. One of the ways it can happen is leadership from above, right? Leadership, that's exactly part of what I was describing, is leadership giving voice to, giving vocabulary to, and giving an agenda of things to do to collectives of people who are persuaded. That's another thing leadership could do. But what about collective action in the absence of leadership, which is a situation we find ourselves in at the moment anyway? It can change anytime. Anything can change anytime. I hope it changes. But what can we do lacking that? Collective action is about organizing. What it means actually is working with other people who agree with you on the big things, and frankly, not getting lost in the weeds of the small arguments. And this is a classic thing that not just the American left wing at the moment, but all left politics, from my period of study anyway, which is all of modern Europe, this is the problem. And actually, if we look back to 1917, where I started, interestingly enough, the one moment in the entire history of the Russian Revolution where all of the various left-wing parties united was to defeat that attempted right-wing coup, the Kornilov offensive. They did it neatly and quickly and completely, decisively. That's what unity could do. It's very difficult. It's also made difficult partly by how political organizations tend to be organized. Often these kinds of organizations have to be kind of given life and held together between moments of huge public interest. It's those tireless people who are working behind the scenes who will hold it together. And frankly, the dynamics of how that often works is it's usually women, often marginalized women, who hold this together because their lives depend on it between crises. Meanwhile, the leadership of these organizations tend to be male, more likely to be less marginalized men, well, not always, but almost always men, who will sort of take the leadership roles. And they are acculturated to expect leadership roles and acculturated to get off on it a little bit, for lack of a better term, to feel like that's part of feeling like a man. Put my shoulders back when I say that, is to have that leadership role, and that can be abused. It's very easily corrupted. It's very easily abused. And particularly when you have a fairly stark dynamic. Now, it's not always stark, but a lot of times, and historically speaking, I've heard this story many, many, many times. When I'm hearing people talking about it in American organizations today, going, oh God, you guys, this story is so old. This story is so old. It can change, but it has to change collectively. And collective action usually changes through a growing awareness. And that's where we get, awareness campaigns as a first step. Sometimes we kind of stop at awareness campaigns. We talk a lot about, is sitting on social media, reading about these things, actually doing anything? Certainly not literally. It may be harming us in terms of, lack of self-care. It's really rough on our mental health. But part of what it can do actually is teach us, is to create an awareness. And that awareness can lead to action. The thing is, we need to then, once people start to feel the will to act, an outlet of what do we do? And in the United States today, it usually is kind of a protest. And those protests have become so regular, the media is not even covering them as a big deal anymore. They're having no immediate impact on politicians anymore, because frankly, politicians are reacting to the money and the people don't have the money. We have reached a point institutionally where votes count less than they ever did, which was never entirely as they were theoretically supposed to. And the money is, our inequality is extreme, more extreme than it was in the Russian Revolution or the French Revolution. The income inequality is so extreme that the vast majority of the population doesn't have anything like the money of a tiny handful. I don't know how to get out of this mess. I know that the way this mess can change is through a combination of collective action and leadership. And those are the two things we seem incapable as a culture of doing right now. And I'm talking about America because this is my context. There are definitely similar problems going on elsewhere in the world, with different nuances, but this kind of collective action and leadership seems to be generally the problem everywhere. How do we create that change? The internet does actually provide us greater tools than human beings have ever had before, both for leadership reaching and communicating with people, and for collective action from people directly to operate, because we can organize so much more easily. And for the moment, while it's still relatively free of access, at least within our part of the world, again, speaking from the United States, we should be using it. I can't give you like an easy pat answer of how to like fix everything, right? But from a historian's perspective, that is how change happens. And I hope that that's helpful in some way. So I'm going to leave it there. Thanks so much. Remember, this is just me talking. I don't represent anyone else or anything else. Thanks.